Chapter 6. The Gift Horse. Once they got home, Brian asked Tommy, "Why don't you get a girlfriend like Miss Vanessa? She's fun and cooks better than us." They laughed at the week's drama, slipped away as they fed the dogs and prepared for bed. The morning was abuzz with, "Is it here yet? Is it here yet?" from Brian. Finally, as Tommy had a lot of work to focus on, he scooted Brian and the dogs out the door to go find some mischief to get into. As he checked on Brian a short time later, he could see a serious game of chase in full swing with a frenzied group circling the barn. Just before lunchtime, Brian burst into the house shouting, "It's here! The horse is here! I see the trailer! I'm headed over!" "Wait," said Tommy. "We'll go over later. I have work to do, and you have some makeup homework that's going to get finished before we do anything else. The sooner we both finish with our work, the sooner we can go play, okay?" With no debate, a stampede of boy and dogs headed up the stairs. The dogs didn't know why they were running, only that when there was running through the house, there was normally some excitement to follow. After eating lunch, Tommy and Brian wandered over to the Levi's property and strolled around to the front of the house. Brian pointed out all the places where Don had mended the fence and even where they had seen a snake, but they were not to tell Miss Vanessa about that because she does not care for snakes, he explained. As they reached the front gate, they could see the horse grazing in the distance, near the main house. "Come on, Dad! There it is! Come on! Come on!" Brian ran toward where the horse was grazing. The horse became spooked and retreated into the pasture. Brian started to follow when all of a sudden a commanding voice from the house said, "Freeze!" Brian froze in his tracks, partly from the command and partly because the strange voice he had never heard before. As still as a photograph, he stood on one leg with the other halfway through the fence. After a few seconds, Tommy told Brian he could move. Brian said, "No way, not until she says it's okay." They both watched as the lady came out of the house and approached. Tommy quickly introduced himself and his statue-like son. "I'm Maisie Levi." She shook Tommy's hand and turned over to Brian. "Are you stuck?" Tommy said, "No. Since you froze him, you must unfreeze him." With a smile, Maisie said, "Unfreeze," in a commanding voice. Brian relaxed. Maisie knelt down eye to eye level with Brian and explained that the horse was scared, so they needed to let him adjust. She said they could come back later and try to feed him some carrots. "Why did it run away? We just wanted to pet it and feed it some treats," Brian said. Maisie explained, "It is a he, and he needs a name. He was not very well taken care of and is now confused. So we have to be careful when we are around him until he understands that we are not going to hurt him and we want to be his friends." With a deflated, "Okay," Brian darted towards the house, then stopped and turned back to Maisie. "Can his name be Moose?" "Moose," Maisie stated. "Why Moose?" "Because he's so big," Brian answered. "Let's wait and see what he likes," she replied with a smile. Back at his own house, Tommy began slogging through the incoming email, and monitoring tensions with communications between the U.S. teams and groups in other countries. Throughout the next few hours, Brian was abuzz with comments about having a new horse next door. Tommy pondered how having a horse nearby could generate so much energy. He smiled as he contemplated how to turn this turn of events could possibly use to his advantage. Like by getting Brian to mow the yard for the next year. Tommy could not help but laugh to himself. After many interruptions from Brian, begging to go to the market to get carrots and ice cream for the horse, Tommy surrendered. But he had to ask about the ice cream. Brian was quick to point out that if Moose didn't want the ice cream, he'd make sure that it didn't go to waste. Though they returned to the Levi's farm twice bearing carrots, nothing they did or said would get the horse to come up to them. Maisie explained that it would take a little while longer. Tommy told Brian it had been a long day and it was almost bedtime, so they had to get going anyway. Maisie assured Brian they could feed him tomorrow. With her assurance, Brian seemed to settle and agree to head home. He wanted to get to bed tomorrow would start sooner. Sunday morning, Brian was off and ready to see the horse as quickly as his feet hit the floor. Tommy had to corral the little escape artist to make him do his chores and eat breakfast. When they arrived at the Levi's, Maisie already had moose tied up to the barn just down from the main house. Vanessa was on the back porch enjoying some coffee, and Don appeared to be tinkering with his old green tractor. Tommy and Brian went up to the house and knocked on the door. Maisie answered, inviting them in and asking if they had had breakfast. Brian quickly replied, "Yep," and Dad burned stuff again, so he had to clean the pans. Maisie turned to Tommy. "Would you like some coffee that is not burned?" "Please and thank you," Tommy replied. Brian moaned, "Aw, man, now I have to wait even longer?" They followed Maisie to the kitchen. "Please and thank you," Tommy replied. Brian moaned, "Aw, man, now I have to wait even longer." They followed Maisie to the kitchen. The coffee was good, unlike the bargain roast Tommy usually made at home. He could smell the hints of nuts and sweetness. He also noted Maisie was very comfortable in the kitchen and house, definitely a student of Vanessa's. Tommy asked about the coffee and was shocked at the volume of information that could be used to describe a single cup of coffee. He made a personal note to never make coffee for any of the Levi's. After enjoying a wonderful coffee and watching Brian almost explode from waiting, they went outside and calmly approached the horse. The closer they got, the more skittish the horse became. He was clearly not happy about being tied up to the post. Brian was becoming afraid to pet the towering horse because the towering horse became up close. It was so much bigger and scarier than he had imagined. He had been around many domestic animals like dogs and cats and even small farm animals like goats and chickens, but never a horse. After some coaxing from Maisie, he finally fed the giant a carrot, then proclaimed he'd had enough visiting with the horse and it was time to let him loose. Maisie did as the boy wished, and the horse ran like bees were chasing him, darting in several directions before settling down on the other side of the pasture. "Maybe we should call him Wildfire," Brian asked. "He sure seems like his tail is on fire right now. But let's give it some time," Maisie responded. On the walk back to the house, Maisie expressed concern that her parents were going out of their way to let her keep the horse at their house. But she didn't want to burden them with the responsibilities while she was away at her home and at work. She inquired if Tommy knew of anyone that would be willing to look after him for the next few weeks until she could find him a home. Brian immediately raised his hand, volunteering himself and his dad while pulling on Tommy's arm. "It will cost you another cup of coffee, not burned," Tommy shrugged. Maisie agreed and then led the new horse keepers around the barn, educating them on the basics of caring for their new friend, which amounted to much more than putting out a bowl of food each night and saying good boy. When they came running to the dinner bell, Tommy was a little unsure as to how he was going to pull this off, but agreed as if it were no big request. Tommy and Brian made their way home, and a short time later saw Maisie pulling from the Levi's home, headed down the tree-lined road. Later that night, Tommy spent several hours trying to corral the horse with no name, although he had given him a few new names in his mind.